My driver ratings for the 2024 Mexican Grand Prix. Starting with the Haas Formula One team, specifically with our man Kevin Magnussen, who qualified in 7th place, finished in 7th place, and I'm going to give him a big old 10 out of 10. What a weekend from K-Mag. He qualified superbly, was 5 tenths in front of Hulkenberg in qualifying. I don't know if Hulkenberg might have had an issue or something. And then in the race, in the first stint anyway, he was up on the back of the Mercedes cars, seemed to have amazing pace, unfortunately dropped off in the second stint. Ultimately a great weekend from Kevin Magnussen, maximised what Haas had this weekend. And yeah, just such a surprising performance from him after it's been Hulkenberg raking in the points for them recently. And moving on to Nico Hulkenberg, he qualified in 10th, finished the race in 8th place, and I'm going to give him a 7 out of 10, which might be a little bit harsh, but I feel like Nico Hulkenberg, with that Haas car this season, he's been so strong, especially recently, and to get outperformed like that by Kevin Magnussen is something that we really haven't seen that often. And I guess it is time that we start considering Haas as the 5th fastest car on the grid. They kind of have been ahead of the rest of the midfield ever since we came back from the summer break. I think overall a decent weekend from Nico Hulkenberg, but seeing him getting outperformed by his teammate is not something that we've come to expect. Moving on to the Sauber team, starting with Zhou Guanyu, who qualified in 20th, finished the race in 15th. I'm going to give Zhou a 3 out of 10. I think his finishing position kind of benefits from the 3 DNFs that we saw in the race, and Perez dropping a stinker and Lawson getting damaged towards the end. So he did manage to gain positions at turn 1, had a good opening stint, but I remember just watching him getting overtaken by Esteban Ocon, who had started in the pit lane, and just thinking that it was such a lackluster defence, and then he ended up finishing 20 seconds off Bottas. I think towards the end of the race, he did end up having some sort of brake issue, he mentioned in his post-race interview, but ultimately it's just a bit of a nothing weekend from Zhou Guanyu. And again, as we say every single week, he's coming to the end of his Formula One career. He's yet to show something that really makes you go wow and think that he deserves a spot on the grid for next year. Moving on to Valtteri Bottas now, he qualified in 15th, finished in 14th, and I'm going to give Bottas a 6 out of 10. He managed to get through to Q2, which is absolutely amazing for the Sauber team. They haven't been at those dizzying heights in a very long time, and ended up finishing the race 20 seconds ahead of Zhou, as I just mentioned. Again, the Sauber car just isn't that fast. They're always going to struggle to finish many places in front of anyone else, but as long as he's outperforming his teammate, it's pretty much a good weekend for Bottas. Moving on to the RB team now, starting with Liam Lawson, who qualified in 12th, finished the race in 16th. I'm going to give Lawson a 6 out of 10. He was outqualified by Yuki Tsunoda this weekend, even though Tsunoda binned it, which we'll get onto in a second. And then in the race itself, I really admired the way that he fought against Sergio Perez. Was really personal between the two of them. You could tell that, Perez coming on the radio after. But the contact that he had towards the end with Colapinto I felt like was unnecessary. Not that he was really fighting for any points, or like 13th position versus 16th doesn't really mean anything at the end of the day, but it was a bit of silly damage really, and that ended up costing him so that he ended up finishing further back. Yeah, not quite as polished a weekend as we saw last week from Lawson. They went for that same sort of hard tyre strategy gamble to begin with in the race. Didn't seem to work as well this week as it did last. So yeah, giving Lawson a 6. And then Yuki Tsunoda, who qualified in 11th place, did not finish the race. I cannot give him a rating this weekend because he literally went out at the first corner. And so yeah, it's impossible to give him a rating. I think, to be honest, the qualifying, him crashing, wasn't great. But would he have really moved through into Q3? I'm not too sure. Obviously, the crash in the race, I don't see as his fault. It was just kind of one of those unfortunate racing incidents that happens at turn 1 sometimes. We haven't seen one in a while, to be fair, but it's always bound to happen when a lot of people are gunning for it. So, yeah. Can't give Tsunoda a rating this week. Moving on to the Williams team now, starting with Franco Colapinto. He qualified in 16th, finished the race in 12th. I'm going to give him a 7 out of 10 this weekend. I think, again, similar to Lawson, it's not one of Colapinto's finer performances in F1. Obviously, he still hasn't had many performances in F1, so we've only got the limited stuff that we've seen so far from him to go by. But this weekend, it didn't seem like he had the pace. He got severely out-qualified by Albon in qualifying going out in Q1, whereas Albon was through to Q3. But I think his race pace overall was pretty good. Finishing 12th was still decent, and he managed to stay out of trouble other than the contact with Lawson, but it didn't seem to affect his car too much after that, so that was pretty good for him. And then moving on to Alexander Albon, who qualified in 9th, did not finish the race. I think it's such a shame for Alexander Albon. He seems to be having some rotten luck recently, and him finally getting into Q3, qualifying 9th, it was a chance for them to get some points. Unfortunately, as I've just mentioned, the sort of racing incident that he had at turn 1 with Gasly and Tsunoda put him out of the race, and so I cannot give him a rating this weekend. Moving on to the Alpine Formula 1 team, starting with Esteban Ocon, who qualified in 19th, started from the pit lane and then finished the race in 13th. I'm going to give Ocon a 2 for this weekend. The qualifying performance was so bad from him that it didn't make a difference for them whether or not he started in P19 or in the pit lane, so that was kind of a no-brainer for them. In terms of pace, Gasly, as we saw, got into Q3. Ocon was second last on the grid. So really disappointing in qualifying, and then in the race itself, he got caught up behind the Saubers for a bit too long. You kind of expected him to make a bit more progress forward, but unfortunately he wasn't able to do so. So yeah, quite a poor performance from Ocon this weekend. I think Haas will be wanting to see some more from him before he jumps into their car from next year, given that they have such good performance right now. And Pierre Gasly, who qualified in 8th, finished the race in 10th. I'm going to give him a 9 out of 10 this weekend. Alpine, as we have seen throughout this season, have a bit of a tractor on their hands, and Gasly, especially in the last 2 race weekends, has been showing that he can be the one to take this team forward and grab them some points. In the end, the gap to Hülkenberg in front was quite substantial, which is the only reason that he's not getting a 10 for this weekend, but I do think that Gasly had a solid weekend overall, and I hope that he can take this performance on into the Brazilian Grand Prix. Moving on to Aston Martin now, starting with Lance Stroll, who qualified in 14th, finished the race in 11th place. I'm going to give Stroll a 7 out of 10 this weekend. I think it was a decent performance from him. In comparison to what we've been seeing from Lance Stroll recently, he has sort of turned a corner, I think, at least for this race weekend. Only being about a 10th off Alonso in qualifying is pretty solid, and then in the race he seemed to have good pace, and then in the race he seemed to have decent pace. He finished just outside the points. I think, to be honest, maybe my 7 is a little bit harsh on him, but it's hard to rate him given that Alonso was out of the race, so we didn't have much of a marker to judge him on. And as for Fernando Alonso, who qualified in 13th, did not finish the race. It's another one that I'm not going to give a rating to this weekend because I don't think that it's fair. He only went out of the race on lap 16, so it's difficult to rate him. I think his qualifying was pretty decent, out-qualified his teammate, which is all you can really ask for. But as I say, the race is impossible to rate. Moving on to Oscar Piastri now, who qualified in 17th, finished the race in 8th place. I'm going to give Oscar Piastri a 3 for this weekend. Out in Q1 this weekend for Oscar Piastri, which really is not good enough. We saw him do the same last weekend in the Austin sprint race qualifying, so maybe an area that he needs to look at going forward. And then in terms of the race itself for Oscar Piastri, it seemed like he was struggling to make progress through the pack, only finishing 8th. I think, to be fair to him, the maximum he could have achieved was maybe 6th in that race. I think he definitely could have got past Max Verstappen with, you know, some more decisive moves earlier on, but we saw in the speed trap data that he was quite slow on the straights, so maybe it's not that surprising that he struggled. And then Lando Norris, who qualified in 3rd, finished the race in 2nd. I'm going to give Lando a 9 out of 10. I think it was a pretty solid weekend. He maybe could have hoped to have qualified a bit further up, but in terms of, you know, the sort of talking point of the weekend, the battles that he had with Verstappen, I'll get on to what I think about Verstappen in that race later on. But in terms of how Lando dealt with it, I think that he, as he said in the post-race interviews, he sort of saw it coming. He knew that Max was going to be aggressive with him. And I think you could kind of see that from the way that he sort of took evasive action, didn't end up in the wall, which obviously would be of more benefit to Max than it would be to Lando, because Max is basically just trying to make sure that Lando doesn't score any points going forward, and then he'll win the championship. So I think overall decent race from Lando. I think he probably would have got Charles Leclerc even if the mistake wasn't made. It didn't look like he had any chance of getting Carlos Sainz, otherwise obviously would have been a 10. But yeah, solid weekend from Lando. He does need to start winning races if he's going to have a chance at this championship though, which I keep saying. But yeah, solid weekend. Moving on to Ferrari now, starting with Carlos Sainz, who qualified in first, finished in first, and it cannot be anything other than a 10 out of 10 weekend for Carlos Sainz. What a performance. Qualifying absolutely excellent, the only driver to dip into the 1 minute 15s, just absolutely miles out in front of everyone it seemed. And then in the race itself, he got overtaken by Verstappen at the start, and I thought that might be curtains for him, but he made that decisive move on Verstappen. It was an absolutely beautiful dive bomb. Not many people catch Verstappen out, but he managed to. And then basically from then on, it was just managing the gap out front. Had great pace throughout the entire weekend, so has to be a 10 for Carlos Sainz. And then Charles Leclerc, who qualified in 4th place, finished the race in 3rd. I'm going to give Charles Leclerc an 8. He was sort of outpaced the entire weekend by Carlos Sainz, but seemed to have decent pace of his own, especially in the race. He was sort of putting Sainz under pressure. The only reason that it isn't a 9 or a 10 is because he did make that mistake that cost him 2nd place. As I say, I'm not sure if he would have held on to it anyway, but it was quite a large mistake. Let Norris through, and then he ended up dropping back a bit towards the end. I think probably dirt on his tyres and just wanting to keep it on the road. So yeah, ultimately, decent weekend from Leclerc. I think he'll be happy with that. Extends his sort of advantage over Oscar Piastri for the battle for 3rd in the championship. And yeah, 8 out of 10 seems fair. Moving on to Mercedes now, starting with George Russell, who started in 5th. Finished in 5th. I'm going to give Russell an 8 out of 10. He obviously did not have the upgrades on his car that Hamilton had this weekend, but once again for Russell it is his fault because he binned the car, and so when the team can't put the car back together the way it was before, that's kind of on him. They obviously are struggling for parts given that he binned it last week as well. So did Lewis Hamilton, but I don't think he caused any damage to the car. But yeah, overall, I think it was a good race for Russell. Nothing particularly special. I think the first stint in particular was pretty strong when he managed to overtake Hamilton after losing the place off the start. But then second stint, it just seemed like he fell back. Hamilton and him obviously had a decent battle towards the end, which I enjoyed watching. And he did manage to keep him behind for a very long time, but his resolve led to nothing in the end, and he did end up finishing in 5th, and I think the 8 is fair. And Lewis Hamilton, who qualified in 6th, finished in 4th. I'm going to also give Lewis Hamilton an 8, as I did for Russell, because Hamilton did have the updates on the car. As much as it almost didn't look like they were doing anything for him, they did basically finish in the same place at the end of the day. Hamilton finishing ahead of Russell, which kind of gives him more points, but then Russell out-qualifying Hamilton, so that's why I've given them the same rating. I think a pretty solid weekend for the Mercedes drivers overall, but they will be worried as a team that they were literally so far off the lead, had absolutely no chance this weekend. So going into Brazil, I can't see them being in the talks for the win. But, they tend to turn up there. We'll see what happens. And last but not least, the Red Bull Formula 1 team, starting with Sergio Perez, who qualified in 17th, finished in 17th. I'm going to give Sergio Perez a 1 out of 10 at his home Grand Prix. I really wanted Sergio to do well this weekend, but to be honest, every part of the weekend was just disappointing for him. Qualifying to begin with, qualifying down in 17th when your teammate is up in 2nd is just not acceptable. And then he gets to the grid and parks a metre outside his grid box, then complains on the radio that he didn't do it when it was very clear. So that was disappointing. Gets the 10-second penalty for that. And then race pace overall, he did make a good start after starting in the wrong place, but how much of that is down to starting in the wrong place, we'll never know. The race pace was okay. He had obviously the fight with Liam Lawson that I think his move was a little bit late. He just sort of dove down the inside, pushed Lawson off, and he was never obviously going to give it up given that they're both fighting for the same seat. Then he had the fight with Lance Stroll where he pushed Lance Stroll off, and that seemed unnecessary. He had damage, so that kind of slowed him down for the race, so maybe I should be a bit nicer to him for that. But yeah, overall, a poor weekend for Sergio Perez when he's battling for his seat. You do not want to be doing that at your home race. I think, once again, I will echo this every single week until I see confirmation of it happening. If Sergio Perez is in that car next year, I will be so surprised. And lastly, the controversial man himself, Max Verstappen, qualified in second, finished in 6th place. I'm going to give Max Verstappen a 5 out of 10 this weekend. To be honest, I think as soon as he got overtaken by Carlos Sainz, he knew that he wasn't in the race for the win anymore, and his only objective was to make sure that Lando Norris didn't win the race. And to be honest, for that, maybe I should give him a 10 out of 10. In terms of the individual incidents themselves, and whether or not I think the penalties were just or not, I think, to be honest, the move at turn 4 where Lando went round the outside and Verstappen pushed him off, maybe a 5-second penalty at best for that one. To be honest, I think the 10 seconds was incredibly harsh because you see that happen at that corner basically every single time. And then in terms of the move later in the lap where he just sort of dove down the outside and took them both off the track, I do believe that the 10-second penalty was fair for that one. So yeah, I'd maybe have given him 10 seconds overall rather than the 10 for both, which I thought was maybe a little bit of the FIA trying to make the championship closer, if I'm honest. If we look at the race result itself overall, if Verstappen did have 10 seconds of those penalties taken off, he's still finishing behind George Russell this weekend, and that Mercedes car was really slow. Just not a good weekend for Red Bull overall. They are truly out of the Constructors' title battle now. I do think that Verstappen still did enough to put off Norris to maintain his title charge. I think he'll still win the title, but yeah, not a good weekend for Red Bull. And with all that, you can see all of my ratings on the screen right now. Pause the video if you want to have a deeper look into them. As for my stinkiest boy of the weekend, unfortunately it has to be the home hero Sergio Perez getting that 1 out of 10. As I've already said, he just had an absolutely woeful qualifying, started in the wrong place on the grid, had no pace, got into the sort of meaningless battle with Liam Lawson where he got damage, and then the rest of his weekend was done. As for my speediest boy of the weekend, it can be no man other than Carlos Sainz this weekend. Truly remarkable weekend for Ferrari overall, but Carlos Sainz in particular. He said he wanted to get one last win with Ferrari before he departs the team for Williams at the end of the year, and he went and did it in style. If you made it all the way to this point in the video, then chances are you love Formula 1 just as much as I do. So make sure to click on this video right here to see my thoughts on the Sauber driver decision for next year.